So I grew up going to church. I wouldn't say that I was really raised in a Christian home, but I grew up going to church, and uh, I knew the gospel. So I prayed sinners' prayers multiple times. I was lacking assurance, and um, it ended up being a good thing that I was praying multiple times. I was not really convicted of sin. I was just praying sinners' prayers without really seeing myself as a sinner. I thought of myself as a good person, and even as if I was better than other people, which of course we know Jesus talked about the Pharisee and the publican, how the Pharisee thought of himself as better, but the publican said, God be merciful to me, a sinner. So I had to go from the one to the other, and it was only that I was afraid of hell, which now that I look back on it, it doesn't make sense that I would be afraid of hell and still think of myself as a good person. But I didn't take it to the logical conclusion. But anyway, so I kept on, needing assurance. I kept on praying these sinners' prayers. Well, one time I went to my youth pastor, and he led me through a prayer. I think it was actually 3 times, and finally it sank in. Something changed. I knew just immediately that something happened. It wasn't an emotional experience, but I could just tell that something had changed. It was maybe like a light came on or something. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but um, I think that was the time I was saved, especially because before and after, I don't know if I ever, had the leading of the Spirit before then, but afterwards I could see the Holy Spirit leading me. So years passed. I wasn't growing a whole lot. I was growing in Bible knowledge, but not necessarily in my relationship with God. Not, I guess I wouldn't say that I grew a whole lot for years. Um, I was a fundamental Baptist, and I was very stubborn about my beliefs as a Baptist. So I was just very focused on these doctrines and everything, and I was also planning to go into missions. So that was pretty much my focus, and not so much seeking a pure heart. I guess I did hear about having God's strength, but that was kind of a mystery. Like, what does this mean to have God's strength? And so then after I got married, maybe a couple of years later, there was this one time I felt like God wanted me to pray, teach me. And so I was just praying that way, teach me. And then also, sometime around then, I was thinking about how people debate over these doctrinal beliefs. And both sides will say, this is so biblical, this is so clear from the Bible. And they'll look at the context and the Greek and everything. And they'll still go away thinking, that the other person's wrong, even though they're both saying that it's biblical. And so I was like, well, how do you know that one person is right and the other one's wrong? And so I just wanted to give up my opinions toward God, to God, for Him to teach me and to just be open to anything He had to show me. And I think that was kind of like an open door for Him to teach me, And so a couple of years later, in 2015, that's when God opened my eyes to spiritual gifts, entire sanctification, power for service, and another thing was spiritual warfare. And there's this one person in our area who was helping me with those things. But during that time, I felt stuck, and it was probably because of my fear-based ideas about God. It was an unhealthy kind of fear, a distance from God, not a healthy fear of God. So I lost motivation for fasting because of it, and that wasn't really because of being attached to food. That was just because of associations, thinking of God as only a judge and a dictator. So that kind of all, I don't know, it hindered me from really pressing forward in that. So that ended up taking a backseat. I was pretty intent about it. I was praying intensely that year, but I just kind of lost enthusiasm or something for a while and just focused on our family and ministry. I prayed a little bit for, sanctification and baptism of the Spirit, but it just wasn't the main thing anymore. Well, then 6 years passed, and God got my attention with numbers. I kept on seeing 222 over and over, and it happened to start around the day when when the boss at my ministry offered me a job there. And So my husband and I have been volunteers at this place for well, I started in 2017. So anyway, I accepted the job. When I prayed about it, I didn't get a yes or a no. It was only the number, and I was thinking, well, God has a plan for this. So I accepted the job, and then I also got a summons for jury duty, and the street address was 222 on a certain street in Anchorage. And after a little while, I realized that it was it was for January and February. I realized that 22222 would fall in that range. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I'll get called in on 22222. I also prayed about why I was seeing the number so much. And something came to my mind, Craig L. Adams. And it's a website I had seen years before. I wasn't really familiar with the website, so I don't think it was my own mind. And, maybe I'd been to it a couple times and seen it in search results. Well, I went to the website and searched for the number 222, and it worked. There was one result that was something like page number 222, another thing that was number 222 on a list. And the results were pointing to sanctification and humility. And one of those things said that there can be a work preceding entire sanctification. And that ended up being really accurate about what God was doing, because he was he was testing me and removing obstacles, especially around that time. So later on, I figured out a verse that applied, 2 Timothy 2:22, about having a pure heart. So anyway, you know how I was summoned for jury duty. I got a call to come in on February 22nd, which was 2/22/22. Normally it would have been a Monday, but there was a government holiday on that Monday, so it had to be the 22nd. And remember, the street address was 222. And I had to mention my job, which was, this ministry job. And that might have been the reason, that there's that connection with the job. So I had to be bold, and I decided to use the name of our ministry that has the name of Jesus, because there's more than one name for the ministry. There were about 65 people listening, so I took it as a test and made sure to pass. And so that was one thing, because I'm normally not bold, but that's one thing that God has been working on me about, boldness. Then 9 months later, to the day, same day of the week, there was another test. And that one brought out a lot of my flaws. There was even a 222 involved. And it reminded me of Deuteronomy 8:3, where God tested the Israelites to expose their hearts. And it just seemed like there were multiple tests throughout that time. And then in 2023, I'll jump ahead, that's when the holiness meetings started. I started going in May. I guess they had started a little bit before then. And about a week later, I mentioned to a friend that I was thinking about having a pure heart, and she was thinking about the same thing. So we were talking on the phone, and she felt led to stop talking. Then after she got home, her phone turned on and played a song called "Give Us Clean Hands," which is about having a pure heart. And I know that phones can turn on if they hear certain words, but I don't think it was that, because she had been out driving at the time we were talking, and it was maybe 25 to 30 minutes later by the time her phone turned on. And the words "pure heart" were not in the title, but in the lyrics. So, sometimes God does things like that, where he'll confirm things by turning on someone's phone or their radio or something. Well, then the next month, I wanted to have a day off to pray. And I told my husband that I'd like to have the next Wednesday off. And then my boss sent an email ahead of time for us to have a day off for the 4th of July. Normally, he wouldn't send an email that early. So it was interesting that it was in time for me to request that Wednesday. And I was thinking about John 17:17, where Jesus said, we're sanctified by the truth, the word. And the holiness meeting was on Wednesday mornings back then, because we used to meet on Wednesdays. And I felt like I really had to bring up that verse. It was just very much on my mind. And now I believe that it was an impression from God. So when the meeting started, I was just waiting to bring it up. And then Brother Frank, he said, in John 17:17, Jesus said, we're sanctified by the word. Well, that was a 5-part story. And that day was a breakthrough spiritually.
Mm.
And since I had the day off, I just focused on God's word. At first, I was just going to pray that day and seek a pure heart, but I was focusing on the word, especially God's glory. And that made a change in my heart. It still was not an experience of entire sanctification, but that happened 3 months later to the day. So I had another experience of feeling sealed. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at notes and
It's okay.
So that was an experience that it was kind of like a vision. It wasn't really vivid, but there were multiple scenes, and one of them was going up to a well. And so I think I drank from the well, and then there was a feeling of being sealed, and it felt like I was sealed against sin. It was like my heart had a like a barrier around it, and so that's one of the first experiences I had. There have been other times that I've felt a pure heart, but that was an interesting, kind of a distinct thing at that point. But strangely, later that day, it was kind of like something broke open, and it just took me by surprise all of a sudden. And I'm not sure, how that worked. If I was maybe giving into negative thoughts or something. There's something that God showed me recently where if I gave into negative thoughts, then I'd be stepping out of sanctification. So that was, maybe the reason why. But the good thing is that after that experience, I had another experience 6 months later to the day, same day of the week. That was very similar of feeling sealed. And then in May of that year, so 2024, I had another test, and it was with 222s. There was another reminder of the 222s, and so that was interesting how God was still testing me. And just something about sanctification, I've noticed that, when God fills our hearts, there's no room for anything else because He's on the throne of our hearts, and there's satisfaction in that. So, why would we want anything else? And also with fear, I've had a lot of struggles with fear, but I've noticed that, lately my relationship with God has been worth more than the things that I used to fear. So it's just easy to act on these things that he wants me to do. Where I used to be hindered, but now it's like, well, of course, I just have joy in my relationship with God, and there's satisfaction in that. So, why fear? And then in the second half of last year, there was a shift where God got my attention about power and spiritual gifts again, just like in 2015. He especially pointed out how He's going to pour out His Spirit in the last days. Joel 2, He will pour out His Spirit on all flesh. And also, I think He got my attention about fasting during that time. So I went back to fasting after 9 years of mostly not fasting at all. And by that time, I was mostly healed about those old ideas about God. The the ideas of only thinking of Him as like a dictator and a judge off in the distance. By that time, I thought of Him as a father. Also, He was teaching me to hear from Him during that time, and He was stretching my faith as far as hearing from Him. But He was also leading me to other people who heard from Him. So first, it was a volunteer from our online ministry. His name is Anthony. Brother Warren, you've met Anthony. And then it was Robert, also, who's been to this meeting. And Robert had some insights for me, some things that God had shown him. One of them was about God's acceptance. And that same month, someone else had a vision. I guess you could call it a vision. I was at this meeting where we were waiting to hear from God. And this one person, she saw things for several of us. And for me, it was about God's acceptance. And so that's interesting because, that's something I've really struggled with. And then in December, same thing. I was at another meeting where we were waiting to hear from God, and this one person, she shared again about God's acceptance of me. So it was just confirming, because of all the fears that I had been stuck in the past. Just knowing that there's acceptance. Of course, the Bible does talk about being accepted in the beloved in Ephesians 1:6, and there are other things that we can look at, but there's also the aspect of us walking with Him, and that's always something that I was insecure about. And He does show us that by the Spirit too. I think 1 John 3:24 is where it says that hereby we know that we're in Him by the Spirit that He has given us. Also, Romans 8:16. So that's one thing, but He also decided to confirm it outwardly. So that was reassuring. And in general, he was leading me to people who hear from Him, and I was developing that discernment of what it's like to hear from Him. Either assurance from the Spirit, or in words. He speaks in words sometimes. Also in September, a volunteer at our online ministry. Her name is Susan. You can see her testimony on my channel, Living by His Grace. So she was talking about something God spoke to her, and so that was a huge thing too. And so she became part of the story, and that became part of the way that God was developing my discernment of hearing from Him. And he did confirm something that He had spoken to me, that ended up being very accurate. I was worried that I might not be hearing from it accurately, but that was accurate. So there were just multiple things that God was doing, throughout this entire story. I like to call it a story of what God is doing. And some things were like 1 in 30,000 chance, or 1 in 50,000 chance, or even, less chance of them happening naturally, just things that God was doing and confirming. Some things I think would even be impossible the way they happened. But, God was just showing how much He was involved. Even someone's life was saved through this, the way that God was working in things. It was just very, very, big, all the things that God was doing. And I just love seeing God involved. That's one of the best things, just seeing God involved, knowing He loves us, and that we have His power. We have power over sin, and we have power to serve Him.